The Lift and Love podcast is rooted in faith, family, and the conviction that loving LGBTQ people is a calling to be embraced, not feared. Produced by the Lift and Love team, we focus on topics relevant to Latter-day Saint LGBTQ individuals and their parents, relatives, friends, and others who are navigating this space with faith. Across episodes, hosts from the Lift and Love team and their guests address current topics, offer practical support, and share experiences related to LGBTQ+ issues. Each conversation is grounded in compassion, honesty, and a commitment to keep families connected to each other and Christ. Learn more and access resources at liftandlove.org. Jeff Strong spent nearly 3 decades in the global consumer products industry in senior executive roles at P&G and Johnson Johnson. He and his wife, Sarah, piloted a 100% service-oriented, rather than proselytizing, mission as mission leaders for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Last December, I had the privilege of pre-reading his book, Torn, Why People Are Leaving the Church and What We Can Learn from Them. As I read through Jeff's findings from surveys of more than 15,000 members of the church, one thought kept running through my mind. I'm not alone. And I think that's exactly what so many of you will feel as you read it. Whether you are LGBTQ yourself or you love someone who is, and you're trying to hold your faith and your family together at the same time. The title Torn captures something I hear over and over from LGBTQ+ members and from their families. That moment when everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the gospel gets shaken. It's a long and painful process, full of searching. For many of us, the wrenching experience can draw us closer to the Savior, but it can make our relationships in our families and our local congregations more complicated. Not only does Jeff speak to the reality of why people are leaving, but he spends a good portion of the book on Christ-like ways we can minister to and love those who are experiencing faith transitions in our families and congregations. I think you're going to like hearing from Jeff and what he has learned as he experienced his own journey. We are so excited to have Jeff here to teach us about his findings and his book, Torn, Why People We Love Are Leaving the Church and What We Can Learn from Them.
Thank you so much.
We have so much to talk about. Yeah, we are thrilled to have you. Let's just kick right off here. Why are people leaving?
Yeah, and first of all, it's great to see you both. And thank you for the chance to come on and share a great discussion. So the first thing I'll start with is to say that the process that people through when they choose to step away from the church is a deeply personal and process. And for the people that go through it, it's incredibly sincere. And we'll get into some of the data that would help us understand what it kind of looks like. But it's a massive deal. It takes a long time. They spend hundreds and hundreds of hours on it. It's a massive wrestle with the tension. The reason the book's called Torn is their love for and loyalty to the church and these other factors that are just pulling on them. And so I think it's important to understand when we look at data and we structure that data to help us understand patterns, we shouldn't diminish the fact that it's a deeply personal and unique thing and everybody experiences it in their own way. Our research suggests that there are 4 primary reasons people step away. And so the first one is lifestyle, about 6%. The second is church history, about 42%. The third is church social issues with the church, about 33%. And the last is church experience, about 18%. And we can probably go into each of those in a little bit of detail so that people understand what
why don't
are in
you?
Those buckets. Yeah, now what I'll tell you before I go into the details is I chose to write the book not necessarily on any of those 4 waves because I believe there's a 5th wave that's crashing over the top of the other 4, and it's culture. And so what happens is you have lifestyle, history, social issue, and church experience issues, but culture can either relieve those tensions or make them worse, okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so let me just give you a simple example. Our church history is what it is. We cannot change it. Okay, those are the historical facts. They are what they are. And for 42% of the people that took our survey, they would say that alone was enough of a reason for me to choose to step away. So I think we have to listen to what they're saying and we have to honor what they're saying. But how we choose to talk about church history and how open, transparent, and accountable we are is culture, right? So culture is what's still within our control. We can't change our history, but we can change how we talk about it. And the same is largely true for the other three waves. And so what I chose to do in the book is talk about how culture can relieve those tensions or make them worse. So diving in a little bit, should we go into some of the details on this?
Totally. Yeah. I was just thinking, not being a surfer, but being in the water, it's like these waves hit you, and then the riptide is the culture that just sort of
I like
you're
that.
Down and twisting
and
around, and it's pulling you out, and you're like, it's too much.
Yeah.
And
the waves always come in sets.
They do come in sets.
Southern California person
Darice
talking here.
Is a Southern California girl.
Yeah. And you know what? We chose the term wave because we think to some degree they came sequentially. Like wave 1 has probably always been there. Wave 2 church history started to show up just after the advent of the internet. Wave 3 has been more recent, right? And we'll get into what that is. But for example, maybe I was out of touch, but I don't remember LGBTQ plus issues being huge 15 years ago, but they're huge now.
No.
Right?
No. So and we just didn't talk about it.
Yeah. So there's some sequentialness to this. And then there's, as Darice said, there's a compounding effect, right? Of these waves, multiple waves hitting you. So most people, they'll cite my primary reason was church history, but these other things were also factors. So that's what the data says. And then I love, Allison, I love that. The riptide is culture, right? And by the way, the people on the beach that pull you out of the surf, that's culture too. So if the culture's working, it pulls you out of the surf. And so wave 1 lifestyle here, for each one, I'm going to kind of give you a bumper sticker for the overall theme. But wave 1 lifestyle, about 6% of people would say, hey, I couldn't keep living this way. And it's not about doubt, it's about depletion. Okay. So they would say the culture was too controlling. I was having mental health strain. Culture was cited by 34%, mental health strain 29%, guilt and shame 25%, and then a big drop off to excess time demands 7%. And so this is about depletion, not about doubt. And it's just lots of meetings, high expectations. Scrupulosity plays a little bit of a role here, where in a comparative kind of community, it amplifies some of those tensions. Now, by the way, I'm not suggesting that it's worse in our church community than it is in other church communities, but that doesn't make it less important, right? And so this wave is smaller, and some critics would say it's probably bigger than you're saying it is, Jeff, because it's not very self-validating to pick this as your primary reason. Okay, double it, and does it change the conversation? Really doesn't. Wave 2 church history and truth claims. The bumper sticker would be the church isn't what it claims to be. And so there are different ways people articulate this. There's really nothing new that came out of our research, but some of the doctrines of the restoration, some of the truth claims, whether it's Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and their fallibility, or whether it is how the Book of Mormon and Book of Abraham were translated, troubling temple practices and its legacy, and then distrusting church leaders. And so it's interesting because a lot of people they'll say, hey, people are human and they make mistakes, and mistakes can be made, but then we have to be accountable. We have to say mistakes were made, and so we can learn from that. We can get better. And so if we don't do that, then that creates a trust issue, not just a church history issue.
Right.
For sure.
Make sense? And then
absolutely.
Wave 3 is church social positions and moral conflict. That was the primary reason for 33%. And the bumper sticker here would be, hey, even if the church is true, I just can't support this. Okay, so number one on that list, 33% cited sexual identity. 27% cited financial stewardship. 20% cited racism. Now, racism is also a historical issue. 13% cited gender equality. And I want to draw a little bit of distinction here. When you drill down into that data, it's a relatively small percent of members that are saying, hey, women should be ordained to priesthood office. So that's not what is being said here. although some feel that way. It's
Right.
really more about the voice of women in the church, right? That women have an important, powerful perspective. They have wisdom. They have the capacity to make a difference. And if their voices are not heard and they're not playing a role in the church, then the church community is diminished by that.
Yeah, I was surprised. This is for a different podcast, but I was really surprised how low that was.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
I would think that, and maybe it was what was at, I don't know, because
I agree with you. And it could have been, it could have been the structure of how the questions were asked. And so, by the way, I'll say something too, that in case there are any of my lovable, wonderful research nerds out there, the right way to think about this kind of research, we're not trying to prove things. We're not trying to win arguments. It's to help us learn. And for example, I'm the guy that did the research with the help of a lot of really bright researchers, but I don't look at the data and think precision. I look at the data and think patterns. So what's the pattern here? And so it's more degree of magnitude, but I agree with you. I think this number probably is low relative to the energy that's in the community.
Yeah. And especially what we see with so many women leaving organized religion and ours included.
Yeah, well, and here's what, you guys know this, but there's a new pattern that young women are leaving our church at a higher rate than any other group.
Which is definitely a pattern to watch out for.
That's what I'm pointing to. Like we know that,
and they're taking their kids with them.
They're taking their kids with them. Yeah.
And so I see that as problematic. Hey, wave 4, 18%. And bumper sticker here would be, people would say, the church doesn't feel like it's led by Christ, and it's not life-giving for me. I'm looking for the living bread of water, living water and bread of life. And I'm not finding it here. I had somebody I interviewed say, I fell in love with the carpenter of Bethlehem on my mission, and I came home and couldn't find him.
Interesting.
And so
you have a stat that shows what percentage of people think that feel like the church is Christ-centered.
Yeah, it was about in rough numbers, it's about an even split. So about half of church members say the culture of the church is very Christ-centered, and then about half, slightly more, say it's somewhat not Christ-centered.
Yeah.
And Allison, as I got into that and I was trying to better understand it, it comes down to two things. One is your individual experience may really vary depending on where you live and what ward you're in and your immediate LDS social circle. And you might be fortunate to be with a group of really Christ-like people, and so that affects your perspective. The other component is people have very different definitions of what it means to be Christ-centered. And so some people would say, hey, being Christ-centered means you follow the example of the Savior, you care for the poor and needy, you live the doctrine of Christ. Other people would say that because this is his church, if you follow the prophet, go to the temple, wear your garments, that's Christ-centered. Right?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so people have very different definitions. And so, for example, if you're a Latter-day Saint that really loves the temple and you experience the Spirit, and that's a place where you connect with divine things, then the temple can be very much Christ-centered for you. And if you're somebody that wants to work in a homeless shelter, the temple's not going to feel Christ-centered to you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's
in our line of work, when we're sharing about love and inclusion, this feels very Christ-focused.
Yes.
And that also feels like a big threat to people who feel that that's not okay. And so we get that tension on both sides.
All the time. You would be living in that world in a big way, right?
Totally.
So anyway, those are the 4 waves. And then what I think is happening is each of those 4 waves creates real tensions for people. And if the culture's healthy, those tensions can be relieved. They're not eliminated, right? People will push back on me and say, hey, Jeff, but let me give you an example of why I think culture can relieve those tensions. Joseph Grenny and I did a separate study where we learned that when people talk to others about their issues, if those conversations are healthy and supportive, and the individual feels like, okay, I was able to be honest about where I'm at, and what I was met with support and understanding, I want to stay here and continue the wrestle. But if you're met with correction, or even worse, containment, then you're going to say, man, I'm going to continue my wrestle, but it's going to be somewhere else. Right.
Right.
100%.
And so and I'm not diminishing the role of just the issues, but there are a lot of people that I know that have concerns or even really serious concerns about church history that stay because they feel like they've been able to kind of resolve that and get comfortable and feel like, okay, I can stay and be my authentic self and be honest about where I'm at. And so I'm okay staying, right? Because there are other factors that tie me to the church. Yeah, I will. And let me just briefly sum up by saying, according to, I put a number out there that's an estimate, right? We don't know for sure the percent of formerly active members that have stepped away, but our best estimate is 40%. And our study actually suggests it's a little bit higher than that, but we're being conservative and saying 40% feels about right. Now, our study alone is...
Since when? Can you remind me?
Yeah, Darice, over the last 25 years.
25 years, okay.
Yeah, it works out to be 1 million people plus or minus 20%. And so we wouldn't make that statement without having validating research from other sources, right? Because our study is not what stat nerds would say, it's not a probability sample, Jeff, so you can't generalize it to the US population. That's in fact true, but it's still very useful research. And
for sure,
the Harvard CES study pegs Latter-day Saints who identify, or the decline in the percent of Latter-day Saints in the United States that claim affiliation with the church has come down about 43% since 2007. So slightly different time period, slightly bigger number. And then maybe the most reliable study is the Pew Religious Landscape Studies. And they pegged that number at about 46%. And so when you have 3 really good studies and they all kind of get you into the same general vicinity, it gives you some degree of confidence that the estimate's probably in the ballpark, right? And that's as precise as I would want to say.
It's a big number. I think those numbers range from 40% to almost half of our members.
Yeah.
And I think you bring up the point that most people don't have their names removed.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. In my study, it was only 13% of the total.
Wow.
So
interesting.
Over 25 years, that's less than 0.5% per year. So a number.
And I that's reflected in my family. And I think that's about right, that number.
Yeah. 3 of my 5 children are out, and 61% of my birth family are out. And my birth family, which is the posterity of my parents, of course, 7 siblings, like about 40, 45 grandkids. And then like when you're talking great grandkids, you're pushing over 100. I don't know any of them that have had their names removed from the records of the church. It's possible that some have, but it would be a small number. Before we move into kind of culture as soil, I want to say one other thing, because people sometimes get confused. They'll say, Jeff, that feels like such a big number. And I hear these narratives of the church is growing like crazy. And so I want to just deal with that for a minute. Both things can be true at the same time. So you can be having new members join through baptism and through children of record turning 8, right? And simultaneously people are leaving, and the net of that can be modest growth. And that's that's where we are.
Okay. And then and internationally, do we know?
Yeah, our study it was not designed to assess what's going on internationally. And I have some perspective in the book. So anybody that's interested in that can dive into the appendix in the book, and there's some international perspective there.
Great.
That came from other sources. Oh, and Allison, you asked about kind of culture as soil.
Yes.
My son, as you know, he left the church from the MTC in 2013, so 13 years ago. And we can talk about that as much or as little as you want, but it was very traumatic for him and for our family. And it's been 13 years, so it's been quite a journey for us. He's doing great. And he actually helped me a lot with the book. So he read the manuscript as it was coming along. And early on, he comes back to me and he says, Dad, I think this is a weak book. I'm like, gee, thanks.
Aren't our kids fantastic?
Yeah. And here was his issue. He said, you framed this as a culture problem. And he said, I largely agree with that, but you just haven't done a good job defining what you mean by culture, and you haven't really brought that to life, and it's not really, there's not really an arc that runs through the book. And so I just don't think it's well done. And he was right. And then he said to me, he said, hey, do you even know what the word means? And I puffed out my chest. I know what it means. I'm a corporate executive, man. I've run giant businesses. And he says, no, the etymology. Have you ever looked up the etymology of the word culture? And ladies, I hadn't. I'm sure you haven't either. But I said, no, I haven't. So I go look it up, and it comes from a 13th century Latin word, colere, which essentially means dirt or soil for the purpose of growing things. And it's the perfect metaphor for what we experience in the church as culture. Soil has two purposes. On one hand, the soil has to hold the roots of the plant. It has to secure the plant so the plant doesn't tip over and die, right? It has to nourish the plant, water, nutrients, oxygen. And healthy plants are going to thrive where the stability and the nourishment are in balance, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's a really good metaphor for where we're at right now. Now, in our research, among the people we surveyed, we had a creative way at trying to get at how balanced the people in our survey felt the cultural soil of the church was. And what we learned is they feel there's a hard bias, a hard leaning towards protection and stability, and not much leaning towards nourishment, right? Yeah. Now, my personal life in the church supports that. That's what I have experienced. And so I think this isn't an issue of, hey, black or white, right or wrong, good or evil. It's an issue of balance and protection of the church. And so what is that? It's doctrine, it's theology, it's authority, it's organization, it's structure, it's leadership, it's all of those, it's standards, right? We need that, or what does it mean to be a Latter-day Saint, right? But we also need nourishment, which is where the Savior comes in, right? It's faith, it's repentance, it's forgiveness, it's compassion, it's loving, it's lifting, it's learning and growing, right?
Yeah, the essence of the gospel.
You have to have them both in balance. Yeah, of course.
Where was your balance before 2013? And when...
Oh, you're going to call me out.
Yeah.
It's what we've been building up for.
Oh, man. So I'm going to go back to when I was a young missionary.
Okay.
I had a nickname in the Australia Sydney mission, and it was Captain Jack, and not Jack Sparrow, by the way. Yeah. So I was like, boom, I was very tough. And my mission president actually pulled me aside once and said, you need to lighten up. And by the way, my mission leaders were phenomenal. Morris L. Watts and Donna Watts. And they were so Christ-like. And he was actually a military guy. So when your mission president's a military guy and he tells you need to lighten up, it's okay. But they taught me, right? They taught me.
Yeah.
And I got to watch them. And so I started to learn then. But Allison, to your question, I've always kind of had a wiring to the rules, right?
Your honesty on that, because I think there's parts of each of us that get really compact and unstructured, and there are parts of us that are more loose.
Well, and can I give you an insight on that? So I've learned sometimes I'm talking to people that on the surface very much disagree with. And often what I learn is we have the same goal. We both want soil that's balanced, but the world I'm living in might be one where there's too much protection and stability, and so I want more nourishment. And the world where they're living in, there's too much nourishment and not enough protection and stability, so they want more of that. And after we really spend time talking, we go, you know what? We actually want the same things.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And then it's tricky because how do you get there, right? And so it's it's a challenging thing.
But it's important, and I love the way you call it out. For a lot of the way, when you put it to soil and nourishment, it takes the personal part of it out.
It does.
So that we can look at it a little softer and say, oh, okay, am I being too structured? Am I being too loose? Am I, and I like that about it. I thought that was a great comparison.
Yeah, thank you. So
credit
to Kale on that.
Credit to Kale.
I tell you, I got an email literally last night late, and I glanced at it and I was too tired, so I read it this morning. But it's from an old friend, and in his late 40s. And so his children are becoming adults now. And he was a lawyer, and he saw a podcast I'd done, and he just sent me a note to talk about that it was very helpful. And he then said, "Hey, Jeff, we were in the same ward a number of years ago." And he said, "Hey, when we were in that ward together, I would have been very much in the protection and stability camp." So he's a lawyer, right? And then he said, and then it was Dot, and then my life happened.
Yeah.
And so he has a beautiful family. One of his sons is gay, and that is part of the life that happened for him that caused him to step back and say, okay, this new reality that is now my family, my old way of thinking is not really working. It doesn't work in this new reality, right? And
right.
so
like you pointed out in your book, the map and the topography are not congruent anymore.
Right.
Yeah. Now, if you're a Latter-day Saint and your map is still working perfectly and you're listening to this conversation, you're going, I don't get it. My map is great, right?
Right.
I've learned to not be too judgmental because, again, I might remember Captain Jeff is my nature, so I just want to just smack him. And I've realized, Jeff, you didn't see it either until you saw it. Right. And so I'm grateful that I have just much more empathy and patience and I'm less judgmental about people whose lives haven't happened in the same way that yours have and mine have. And so we have to be able to accommodate each other a little better.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Totally. And your friend's experience is the experience of thousands of people that listen to Lift and Love, come to us for help, because unfortunately there isn't cultivated ground yet from deep within the church that supports and guides and leads us as families through this.
Yeah.
And it's such a massive shift, not only in your family and what you have, but actually in the way you see eternal families. And there's grappling that has to be done there, and there are ideas and beliefs and whatnot that you have to make amends with. You have to really dig in ways that you don't if your family is more typical or more the traditional family.
Yeah.
And that the pain and the struggle, like you talked about, people who get in this, it cannot be understated. How absolutely upending and painful and disorienting it is. And what an incredible opportunity it is to walk with God and to get direct, just be like, I can't deal with this right now, so it's just you and me, God, and let me teach me and help me and protect, comfort me.
When we get rid of our map and have to go straight to the Liahona and just...
Yes. And it's interesting to me because as I've spent obviously a lot of time thinking about, given the issues, right, the reasons people cite, the cultural issues, what could we do differently? And I think as I've ground my way through all of the issues, the single issue that to me is the most complex, the most sensitive, is sexual identity. And I'm simplistic sometimes in my thinking, but I think of church history and I go, that the history is what it is, but the solution is pretty straightforward, right? It's very much within our grasp. We need to be open and honest and transparent. We need to make space for people to talk about their church history concerns. Where we make mistakes, we need to be accountable. And if we do, that issue will largely over time, I think, disappear. Sexual identity is really a really difficult one because we have the map, there's a bigger gap between the map and people's reality. And I don't know what the solution is, but I know that we can all be more Christ-like, right? And so at a minimum, that's the least that we should expect of ourselves. I'd love to tell you about a man that I interviewed as part of my research. I won't use his name, but he grew up in Utah, and he is your classic, traditional Utah County Latter-day Saint, and just absolutely loved the church growing up. Loved seminary, loved young men's, served a mission, married in the temple, and white shirt and tie guy, and the church was just working for him. And so And so he tells me the story of this classic playbook Latter-day Saint life. And then he said, I hit a certain age, and he and his wife had 3 children. And then he said, I couldn't do it anymore. My wife and I sat down and had an adult conversation, and she already knew, but he said, I'm gay and I can't do it. I can't do it anymore. And again, such a complex issue, but I'm relating his story. He said that this was an adult conversation, and there was a recognition that it wasn't sustainable, but there was also this deep love and respect and appreciation for what they had done together. And they have 3 children, right? And so they very amicably divorced, and they have joint custody of their children. And she remarried a man, and he also married a man. And so I asked him, I said, how are you doing? And he said, I'm doing well. I have a really good relationship with my former spouse. I have a loving, deep relationship with my children. And I'm with a man that I love, and we have a good life together. And so I was inspired and happy for him, but then I just sensed something in him, a little sadness. And so I said, I'm sensing something. Can I ask you what that's about? And he said, I miss it.
Yes.
Yeah, I miss it.
I've heard it hundreds of times.
Yeah.
Hundreds of broken hearts.
Yeah. I said, why don't you come back? And he said, they wouldn't have me. Not like I am. I can't be honest about who I am, but not for that, I probably would. And so that was a big moment for me where I said, okay, this is the complexity of it, right? And I don't know what the answer is. I know the church in general has tried to make progress here. I know that individual members are trying to make progress here. Obviously, we have a lot more work to do. But to me, this wonderful man became an archetype for me of the issue, right?
And we miss him.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
We'd be better with him as part of our group.
I have another person that I've talked to that's one of my missionaries. I probably had, I think 7 of our missionaries that have non-traditional sexual identity, and some of them shared that with me as one of our missionaries, and then others, it came out, they chose to share it later. But one of them is a woman, and she refers to herself as queer. And so Sarah and I had a lengthy conversation with her, and she, at the time of the conversation, she was in her mid-20s. She was a Relief Society president in a student ward, and she loves the church like so much. And here she is, the ward Relief Society president, doing great. And I just asked her, I said, how are you doing and where is this going? And she said, I don't know where it's going. And then she used this metaphor. She said, I feel like I'm a polar bear on a melting sheet of ice.
Oh,
yeah.
And she said, I don't know what my future holds. And then she framed, do I live a life alone in celibacy, or do I have a relation of intimacy in a family with a woman? And I don't know what I'm going to do, but I can feel the ice melting.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't have an answer for her, right? I can't say anything that relieves that tension other than you belong with us, right? So we are your friends.
Yeah.
And we love you. And that's about all I could offer. But wow, if these kind of conversations don't wake you up to the tension that people are trying to deal with, and this idea that they just, because they have non-traditional sexual identity, they just scurry out of the church, right?
Yeah.
And that's an important part of the findings that you had, is that very few people scurry away.
Yeah,
no.
It's a wrestle, a 10-year wrestle.
Right?
Yeah, I'll cite a little data. I'll cite a little data on this because it really, 36% of people cited that they spend at least 100 hours over several years. And then 49% said limitless hours over 5+ years. And then if you look at the data, most of the issues that eventually will cause disaffiliation, for about half of Latter-day Saints, they emerge in teens and 20s, but then they leave in their 20s and 30s. So it looks like there's about a 10-year lag from first issue to tangible step away, about 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And when you talk to them, and I've interviewed dozens, it's like the death of their best friend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And deeply serious, thoughtful, painful, rigorous, and so difficult.
Totally.
Yeah. And Jeff, your story that the missionary and both missionaries makes me think of Brene Brown, who talks about the difference between fitting in and belonging.
Yeah.
Where, as he said, they wouldn't take me back the way I am. And I feel like one of the things that your book brings to light so beautifully is right now, depending on maybe where you live, what your lived experience is at church, for me, it feels very much a fitting in, a conformity expectation. Yeah. I would love for us to get to the belonging where, where we can say the sheet of ice isn't melting. Like we will keep you as the polar bear protected, It's like the trade-off is we're losing the people that don't feel that they can continue authentically because they no longer can fit in and not be harming their spirit.
Let me ask you, why is it so hard for people to just psychological? Is it protection?
Yeah, Allison, it's a good question. I don't know that I have any powerful research, but I have an opinion. But I think one factor is if you haven't experienced being marginalized yourself, it's almost impossible to have empathy for people who are marginalized. Yeah. And I'm by almost every objective measure, I'm as classic a Latter-day Saint as you can possibly be. And so people might say, what do you know about this? Probably very little compared to most people. But I have been in settings where I felt that I was fitting in but not belonging. And the most brutal kind of loneliness is to be alone in a crowded space.
For sure.
And so if you, whatever the reason is, you don't fit, but you're in a room full of people, and it actually amplifies your sense of isolation. And so sometimes as a matter of survival, you have to say, I have to get away from feeling so isolated.
Yeah.
And so people walk away. And if you haven't experienced those overpowering feelings, you can look at that with lack of empathy or even contempt. And you can say things like, if they were just faithful, they would stay. And I think that's an incredible oversimplification of the issue. And then I think the second factor is, you should probably elaborate on this, but before we went on camera, you were talking a little bit about we are progressing in some ways. And you talked about how parents today are dealing with this so much more constructively than they did even 20 years ago, right?
Well, sure. And you're a big believer in the disruptive theory.
Sure.
And the influences and how disruption is hard because there's grieving, right? Nobody likes change. But it used to be that you could push the queer person out of, they usually probably didn't come out until they were already out of society, of their original community.
Yeah.
And you could explain it away. But nowadays, these kids, they come out at about 14 years old.
Yeah.
And they are deeply, deeply held in their homes and by their parents. You've got these parents who are actually in this with their children. They are managing often really scary mental health challenges, kids being left out, bullied, and hearing things at church, which is really disruptive because then not only are you trying to figure out how to help this child and how to help what's in the best interest of this child, but what does our family look like? And all of a sudden, we went from comfortable to uncomfortable in our community.
Yeah, can I share a perspective that hits home here? And it's not on sexual identity; it's on race. But I central Utah in a small town, and I had a wonderful, idyllic life there.
Yeah.
But in Springville, I was born in '63, so I came of age in the late '60s, early '70s. There was one Black person in Springville. She was adopted. Mm-hmm. And she was actually in my ward. And then there was one Catholic family in Springville that I knew of. Now, there were probably other male families, but at least in my circle, I knew of one Catholic family, and I didn't know anyone who had non-traditional sexual identity, like zero. Back to the frame of reference I had growing up, I didn't see malicious racism in Springville at all, but we were so unfamiliar with people who weren't white that we had a natural kind of inherent suspicion, right? And so there was that suspicion of, well, they're not white or they're not Latter-day Saints. And so we view them with suspicion. And I was at Procter & Gamble during the 90s, and this goes back, do you remember the LA riots, the Rodney King riots? I was there. Okay, so I was staying at the LAX Sheraton, and Crenshaw Boulevard is just east of the LAX Sheraton, and they wouldn't let us out. We were in meetings all day long. We came out of the meetings, there's smoke in the lobby, and they say, go up to your rooms and don't go outside. So I was on the east side. I opened my curtains and I could see the fires. It was maybe a half mile away. And I stayed up all night watching the news program on the television and it playing out on the streets. And I just didn't understand the anger that was manifest, right? Being so sheltered. And I was not, I was an adult at that point, but I had a really good friend at Procter & Gamble, a guy named Ken Wilson, who is Black. And I asked Ken to kind of take me to school on that. And so Ken is a very loving guy, and we're dear friends to this day. And the very first time we had lunch and he was going to educate me on racism, he didn't mess around. He just looked at me and said, if your daughter came home with a Black man and said she wanted to marry him, would you be okay? And you know what my answer was then? No.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I was probably 35 years old and I had daughters. And it was just so out of the realm of what I had ever contemplated. And by the way, being around amazing Black men and women like Ken and many others, I quickly lost those feelings of prohibition, right?
Right.
But I had to go through a process. It's part of what's going on. You would know better than I, but I hope we're growing. I hope we're growing.
I do think we are. The thing that I look for is, as you have a gay couple who are married and living life, and as you sit with them in church, and talk to them and have dinner at their home, and you quickly understand that the fears we all had are not founded in reality. And not to mention, these people who feel they are not very wanted in our culture are still there.
Yes.
And they are sitting on icebergs,
waiting,
trying
hoping.
to hold on, weighing and hoping, and trying to hold on to their spiritual and their spiritual community and their connection to God, which sometimes we separate them from.
Yeah.
And the more kids that grow up in our wards and bishops who have to think, what am I going to do when this child hits a young men and young women's, and there's gendered issues that I'm supposed to hold up, but I know what this will do to this child. And it's happening in my neighborhood and to many people I know. What do we do? This child is beloved by our neighborhood, and what can we do? And those are the things that will expand. I believe it really strongly.
Yeah,
there.
I agree. And it's funny because in the book I talk about the first imbalance is the conflict between standards and acceptance, right? And I've had some people that are more orthodox in their views say, Jeff, are you arguing for the reduction in standards, right? And I'm not. And I tell a beautiful story to illustrate why I'm not. But one thing that we have to keep in mind is ultimately the purpose of the church is to help people come to God, right? And experience the power of the gospel and the teachings of the Savior in their lives. But they can't be rooted in Christ if the church soil won't let them in, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea isn't, let's just accept people for the sake of accepting them, although that's not a bad idea. It's accept them, embrace them to help them sink roots in the gospel so they can enjoy the benefits of that. Right.
Right.
And even if you're very orthodox, I think that's something that we can all agree on, right? That ultimately, if we embrace them, their chances of experiencing divine connection and growth in the gospel go up dramatically.
Right.
What's worrisome about that is we're just human. And so whether no matter where you are at on this issue, the way we experience God is often we experience God by proxy through the church and its members. And its members are harsh to you. It's easy for you to ladder that up to, this is God being harsh to me.
Right.
Right. And so I think we have
Totally.
to be really careful of that. Really, really careful.
Ronell Hugh, who's the president of the Genesis Group, he's a Black man. And a couple of weeks ago, he was out walking in his neighborhood and somebody yelled a really vile threat to him. We were having a conversation and he said, it only takes one person to ruin Zion. And
I believe that.
I think that's super powerful. We've been called to gather Zion, and it's not easy. Let's talk about when sometimes it's a leader that causes distance.
What
Christ-like.
happens, just to both shine a light on this and do it with some grace, a leader naturally feels a responsibility to be a steward of the organization, right? The church, right? So I feel a responsibility to, for example, ensure integrity in the way the doctrines are taught in the Word. And if people are doing things that need to be corrected, the responsibility of correction falls on me. So I'm the person that is responsible to do that. And so I get that. And so the natural inclination is I need to correct. And then if I can't correct, I have to contain.
Yeah.
And so often it's based in fear, right? So there's a fear that if I don't correct this, then it could get worse. And if I don't contain it, it could spread. And my experience as a leader is those things generally aren't true, right? And actually, sometimes it's the fear response that actually brings about the negative outcome that we're trying to avoid.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Paul said, a perfect love casteth out all fear, right? Over 100 times in the scriptures, the idea of fear not or be not afraid is communicated. And it's because when we're being led by our amygdala, we're not doing well, right? We don't do well. Our judgment deteriorates. I don't think the Spirit is manifest. And that was, Darice, that was one of the insights of the work Joseph and I did, is if a devout parent or devout church leader is correcting and containing versus connecting and understanding and supporting, then the likelihood of somebody stepping away doubles in the case of parents. It increases 4.5x in the case of a church leader.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a fascinating study. The book is fascinating. And I think I think people will be surprised about what they'll learn.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, as a last question, did you expect how many people would relate to it? Did you see that coming?
I did to a degree, but not to this degree, right? So it's been even more than I thought. But let me tell you why I thought it might really, very large segment of the Latter-day Saint community that loves the church so much and loves the gospel so much, but they live and persist in a state of conflict and tension.
Yeah.
And it's largely invisible and it's largely unspoken. And that just is a recipe for an explosion of release, right? And so when somebody says, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea if we talk about this? People want to talk about it, right?
Totally.
And so in our survey, for example, we were shooting for about 3,000 respondents and we got 15,000. And when I was trying to read, for a while, I was trying to read the verbatims. We asked simple questions like, why do you love the church? And they would write. And there's so many amazing things in what they wrote. And then we said, why did you leave? And they would write. And some of them wrote little blurbs, church history. Some wrote paragraphs, some wrote pages. We got over 10,000 pages, 10,000 pages.
Oh, my word. Yeah.
And the researchers that I work with, so most researchers would say, look, if you ask more than 20 questions and it takes more than about 15 minutes, you're going to get massive survey fatigue and it won't work. My team, my advisors did research for the church for decades, and they said, Jeff, just trust us. Okay, people will take this survey. Our survey had 71 questions. And in round numbers, the average time it took people to take the survey was an hour and a half.
Wow.
And they did it.
That's incredible.
And you kept them.
Yeah, they did it. Now, there were some that halfway through and say, okay, I've said my piece, I'm out. But One respondent said this was therapeutic for me to take this.
I bet.
Oh, I'm sure.
And so that I think that's what's happening is that this is helping them feel seen. They feel a sense of validation. They feel less alone. They feel grateful. They feel hopeful. And I think that's what's creating the energy around this.
I feel the same. People ask me daily, why do you stay? And it's because there's so much goodness here.
I
and
totally
it could
agree.
Be even better.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's so hard, Allison, because it's so complex. And if you're feeling that deep love and loyalty to the church and you're feeling excruciating tension in your personal life, like where do you go with that?
No.
It's very tough. And so
it's hard to maintain for years and years.
It is. So I mentioned earlier that I don't know what this looks like, right? We're all trying to figure this out, but together, right? So this is great. Christ a hard time because he and his disciples didn't fast when they were supposed to. And he explains to them that, hey, it's important to do that, but there's something more transformative going on. And then he says, you can't take new wine and put it in an old bottle or the bottle will burst and you lose the wine in the bottle. You got to have a new bottle for the new wine. And what I see is hundreds of thousands of Latter-day Saints, and life has given them a massive dose of new wine that they can't get in the old bottle. And they're trying. They're like working so hard. I've got to find a way to make this work. And if we as a church community say, you're doing it wrong. If you can't get the wine in the bottles, you're doing it wrong. That old bottle is perfect. And then they start to not trust us because they say, look, I know it's not working. I've been trying for years. And if you're telling me that I'm doing it wrong, then I'm starting to not trust you. And so I don't know what the new wine bottle looks like for faithful, believing Latter-day Saints. That new bottle has got to accommodate the new wine that we're all dealing with.
Jeff, the book, I truly appreciate the book. I just went through it for the second time. I think what you've done is really important. I know you have done this just out of your love for the gospel and for people. So thank you for doing this.
Those words are so kind, and I'm so grateful. I love the church, and I love the church community. I see the pain of people trying to make it work, and I think there's more we can do in a faithful context to relieve some of those tensions, and hopefully we can figure out together how to do that.
I love it. I hope so too. Thank you so much,
you bet.
Jeff.
Yeah, so good to be with you guys.
To learn more, visit liftandlove.org, where you'll find links to donate, volunteer, and to shop our store, where all proceeds go back to run the many Lift and Love programs. Thank you for everything you do to lift and love.